Welcome to Learning English from People.
F. Scott Fitzgerald, the poet of the broken American dream. In the early part of the 20th century, America was a country of great change and excitement. It was a time of jazz music, wild parties, and new freedoms. This period, known as the Jazz Age, was a decade of glamour and excess, a beautiful, dazzling party that seemed like it would never end. And no one captured the spirit of this age better than F. Scott Fitzgerald. He was not just a writer who described the era. He was a central character in its story. His own life was a dramatic tale of ambition, love, success, and heartbreak, mirroring the very stories he wrote. This is the story of the man who gave the Jazz Age its name and became one of America's greatest writers. Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald was born in St. Paul, Minnesota, in 1896. His family was middle class, not poor, but they lived in a world surrounded by the very wealthy. From a young age, Scott felt like an outsider looking in. He was a boy with great intelligence and a deep love for literature, but he was also acutely aware of the power and allure of money. This feeling of being a poor boy in a rich town would stay with him his entire life and become a central theme in his work. He was ambitious and dreamed of becoming a famous writer, a dream that would lead him to one of America's most prestigious universities, Princeton. At Princeton, Scott was more interested in writing and socializing than in his studies. He wrote for the university's literary magazines and plays, honing his craft and making friends who would later become important figures in the literary world. It was during a Christmas break from college that he met a young woman who would change his life and inspire his most famous characters. Her name was Ginevra King. She was a beautiful and wealthy 16-year-old from Chicago. Scott fell deeply in love. For a time, their romance was like a storybook, but it was not destined to last. Ginevra's upper-class family did not approve of Scott. They saw him as a young man with no money and uncertain prospects. Her father famously told him, "Poor boys shouldn't think of marrying rich girls." The rejection was a devastating blow. It filled Scott with a sense of failure, but also a burning determination to succeed. He wanted to prove that he was worthy, that he could achieve the wealth and status that would win him the love of a woman like Ginevra. This painful experience became the emotional core of his greatest novel, The Great Gatsby. Feeling lost, Scott dropped out of Princeton in 1917 and joined the U.S. Army as World War I raged in Europe. He dreamed of becoming a war hero, but the war ended before he ever had a chance to go overseas. While stationed at an army camp in Alabama, his life took another dramatic turn. At a country club dance, he met Zelda Sayre. She was the daughter of a prominent judge, a beautiful, high-spirited, and wild Southern belle. She was the most popular girl in Montgomery, and Scott was immediately captivated by her energy and fearless spirit. They fell into a passionate romance. However, history repeated itself. Zelda loved Scott, but she was used to a life of comfort and luxury. She refused to marry him until he could prove that he could be financially successful. Once again, Scott was faced with the same challenge. To win the girl, he needed to make his fortune. After leaving the army, he moved to New York City to work in advertising while trying to sell his short stories. But success did not come easily. His stories were rejected over 120 times, and he lived in a single, cheap room, feeling more and more like a failure. His dream of a life with Zelda seemed to be slipping away. In June 1919, she broke off their engagement. This second rejection pushed Scott to his breaking point. He felt defeated, his dreams crushed. He quit his job and returned to his parents' home in St. Paul. There, Living in an upstairs room, he decided to make one last, desperate attempt to achieve his dream. He put all his energy into rewriting a novel he had started in the army. He called it This Side of Paradise. It was a story about his own life, his experiences at Princeton, and his romances with Ginevra and Zelda. He worked day and night, giving up parties and drinking, and staking his entire future on this one book. One evening in the fall of 1919, a telegram arrived from the publisher Scribner's. They had accepted his novel. It was the moment everything changed. Overjoyed, Scott ran through the streets of his neighborhood, stopping cars to share his incredible news. When This Side of Paradise was published in March 1920, it was an instant sensation. It sold out in days and made F. Scott Fitzgerald a household name overnight. The book spoke directly to the young generation of the 1920s, and suddenly, Scott was a literary celebrity. Magazines that had rejected his stories were now eager to publish anything he wrote. With his newfound fame came money, and with money, he could finally win Zelda. She resumed their engagement, and just 1 week after his book was published, they were married in New York City. The 1920s had begun, and Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald were ready to become the king and queen of the jazz age. They lived a life of incredible glamour and excitement. They stayed in expensive hotels, attended wild parties, and became famous for their reckless and charming behavior. They were young, beautiful, and rich, and they symbolized the carefree spirit of the era. Scott continued to write, publishing his second novel, The Beautiful and Damned, which was also a success. To support their expensive lifestyle, he also wrote many short stories for popular magazines, earning more money than most people could dream of. In 1922, they moved to Long Island, a wealthy area outside New York City. The extravagant parties and the lives of the super-rich people they met there gave Scott the inspiration for his next novel. He and his family, which now included their daughter Scotty, moved to Europe in 1924. It was there, on the French Riviera, that he wrote the book that would become his masterpiece, The Great Gatsby. It was the story of a mysterious millionaire who throws lavish parties, all in the hope of winning back the woman he lost years before because he was poor. It was a story born from Scott's own heartbreak and ambition. While in Europe, their own lives began to show signs of trouble. Their marriage, always stormy, became more difficult. Zelda felt restless and had an affair with a French pilot, which nearly destroyed their relationship. Scott's friendship with other writers, like Ernest Hemingway, was complicated by professional jealousy and personal disagreements. When The Great Gatsby was published in 1925, it received good reviews from critics, but it was a commercial failure. It didn't sell nearly as well as his first 2 novels, which was a huge disappointment for Scott. He had poured his heart into the book, believing it was a true work of art, but the public seemed uninterested. As the 1920s came to an end, the great party of the jazz age began to wind down, and so did the Fitzgeralds' golden life. In 1929, the stock market crashed, leading to the Great Depression. Suddenly, America was a more serious, somber place. People were no longer interested in reading stories about the glamorous lives of the rich. Scott's popularity began to fade, and with it, his income. At the same time, his personal life was falling apart. Zelda's behavior had become increasingly erratic. In 1930, she had a mental breakdown and was diagnosed with schizophrenia. For the rest of her life, she would be in and out of expensive hospitals. The cost of her care placed a huge financial burden on Scott. He had to keep writing short stories for magazines, work he had come to hate just to pay the bills. The 1930s were a period of steep decline for Scott. He struggled with his own demons, especially alcoholism. His heavy drinking had begun as part of the jazz age fun, but now it was a serious illness that was destroying his health and his ability to write. He published his fourth novel, Tender is the Night, in 1934. It was a beautiful but sad book based on his and Zelda's tragic life in Europe. Like Gatsby, it failed to sell well. Scott felt like a failure. The world that had once celebrated him seemed to have forgotten him. In 1937, in a desperate attempt to make money, Scott moved to Hollywood to work as a screenwriter. He earned a good salary, but he hated the work. He felt like a hack, a talented artist forced to do uninspired work just for a paycheck. His alcoholism continued, and his health worsened. He was estranged from Zelda, whom he visited when he could, but their marriage was effectively over. He found some happiness in a new relationship with a Hollywood columnist named Shayla Graham, who tried to help him stay sober. During this time, he began working on a new novel, The Last Tycoon, about a powerful Hollywood producer. He was putting all his remaining energy into it, hoping it would be his great comeback, but he would never get to finish it. On December 21, 1940, while sitting in Shayla Graham's apartment, F. Scott Fitzgerald had a massive heart attack and died. He was only 44 years old. At the time of his death, Scott believed his life had been a failure. His books were out of print, and he was remembered, if at all, as a symbol of a forgotten, frivolous era. Only a few people came to his funeral. It seemed his brilliant star had burned out completely. But that was not the end of his story. Fitzgerald once famously wrote, "There are no second acts in American lives," but his own life proved him wrong. During World War II, a few years after his death, The Great Gatsby was reprinted in a special, inexpensive edition for American soldiers. Millions of young men read the book and discovered its magic. Slowly, critics and readers began to re-evaluate his work. They saw that The Great Gatsby was not just a story about the 1920s. It was a profound and timeless story about the American dream, about hope, money, love, and loss. Today, F. Scott Fitzgerald is considered one of the greatest American writers of the 20th century. The Great Gatsby is read in schools and universities all over the world and has sold tens of millions of copies. The man who died thinking he was forgotten is now a literary legend. His life, like his novels, was a brilliant and tragic story of a man who chased a beautiful dream, caught it for a moment, and then watched as it all slipped away, leaving behind a legacy of beautiful, heartbreaking, and unforgettable words.